Hey guys, it's Lauren back with episode 3 of the Depolarizers podcast, where we talk to those who are effectively working to depolarize American politics. In today's episode, we have Patrick Ruffini and Ruy Teixeira to talk about the decline of racial polarization in America. What caused it, and how will it affect elections and cycles to come? Thanks for joining, and let's get into it. Patrick Ruffini is a Republican pollster and one of the country's leading experts on political targeting, technology, and demography. He's co-founder of Echelon Insights, a polling and analytics firm, and has advanced the digital and data-driven transformation of American politics in numerous roles over nearly 20 years. Patrick began his career working for President George W. Bush, including roles at the Republican National Committee, his re-election campaign, and in his administration. Patrick is author of Party of the People, Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition Remaking the GOP. Ruy Teixeira is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and co-founder and politics editor of the Substack newsletter, The Liberal Patriot. He is co-author of The Emerging Democratic Majority and the recently released Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. Dr. Teixeira holds a PhD and MS in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Patrick and Ruy, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, glad to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great to be here as well.
So let's go on and get into it. Today, we're talking about the decline of racial polarization. So Ruy, let's kick us off with you discussing why do you think we've seen this decline in racial polarization, and kind of describe to us how you have seen that demography is not necessarily destiny for Democrats and why that's been happening.
Okay, well, maybe the first thing to talk about here is just what was meant by the demographics as destiny thesis. And in particular, looking at, how it related to race, to the rise of non-whites as a share of population and of voters. The implicit theory of that theory, implicit assumption, was that if, in fact, Hispanics and Blacks and Asians maintain their really high voting rates for the Democrats, then logically it follows as they become a greater share of voters, this will help the Democrats a lot, right? I mean, it's just mathematics. However, what people tended not to think about is the obvious fact that if a group becomes a larger share of voters, but at the same time their margin for, your preferred party, the Democrats, goes down, those two things can and in fact will cancel each other out depending on trends. So this was always lurking in the back of the demographics as destiny thesis, this rather obvious logical hole in it. And I think what we're seeing now is that logical hole is sort of evidencing itself in real life. I mean, if we look at 2020, for example, despite the fact that Democrats ran on a pretty forthright, sort of in some ways identity politics campaign. They thought they really had Trump right where they wanted him in terms of being a guy who was supposedly a racist, particularly hated Latinos and so on and so forth. They felt that they would, basically get a huge boost from both the increasing share of non-white voters and from the fact they would, of course, all vote almost unanimously against Trump. Now, that didn't turn out to be true. I mean, exactly what I was talking about happened. The margins for the Democrats declined very significantly among non-whites, particularly among Hispanics. We're talking about a 16-point decline in the Democratic advantage among this growing sector of voters. And what we did see instead of that increase in racial polarization, we saw overall an increase in class polarization between the non-college voters and the college graduates. So that really undercut the Democrats' sort of premium from their political position among non-whites. For example, again, going back to Hispanics, if you look at the data, it's pretty clear that the decline in the Democrats' margin among Hispanics in 2020 was driven fundamentally by working class Hispanics, who, of course, are the overwhelming majority of the Hispanic voting population. So, racial polarization did not increase, it decreased, and it decreased because working class non-whites in particular started bailing out from the Democrats, despite, again, running against Trump and the Trumpified Republican Party, which, again, wasn't supposed to happen. Now, why would that be? Patrick has written a lot about this, and other people have as well. if you think carefully about who non-whites are, and you look at Latinos, Blacks, Asians, and you look at their underlying distribution in an ideological sense, what are their preferences in terms of their ideology, in terms of a number of policies? They're not they're not remotely all liberal. They're mostly moderate to conservative, and in particular, the conservative members of these groups were voting way above their ideology in terms of their support for the Democrats. And one thing that, as much as anything else, drove this crash and racial polarization was a lot of conservative identifying non-whites, particularly Hispanics. They basically started voting their ideology more, not necessarily more than their identity, more than their ethnic group, but definitely sort of moved in that direction, where that sort of that, in a sense, premium the Democrats were deriving from getting this sort of disproportionate support among a conservative group really drastically crashed. And I think we're starting to see some of this happen among moderate non-whites as well, particularly non-white working class voters. So I think, and why is that? I think it has to do with, how the Democratic Party has evolved in many ways. I mean, if you can't rely forever on identity politics, on, our group is attached to the Democratic Party, therefore they will always vote in the pre-existing proportions heavily for the Democrats. I think a lot of these non-white working class voters in particular, they've to some extent lost faith in the Democrats as being their economic sort of their preferred party in terms of economics. They don't feel necessarily delivered from them all that well. We see the contrast between economic performance under Trump prior to COVID and economic performance under Biden. But I think there are also underlying reasons for that that go back considerably farther. And then you have the Democrats' sort of hard left turn on cultural issues, which I think really has left a lot of these voters behind, on everything from race and gender to crime and immigration, and just a general sort of embrace among the Democratic Party of sort of a very liberal, wokish, if you will, turn on cultural issues. I mean, for example, if you look at Hispanic, especially Hispanic working class people, who are overwhelmingly patriotic, upwardly mobile, moderate to conservative population who isn't at all on board with these boutique cultural issues, which seem to play an increasing role in the Democratic Party, and they're trying to appeal to these voters on the basis, well, you're an Hispanic, of course you got to vote for the Democrats. I mean, who else would you vote for, right? I mean, we're your party, and I think that has become increasingly unconvincing to a lot of these voters. And the irony of it, in a sense, Lauren, is that even as the Democratic Party has embraced identity politics more, the people for whom identity politics is supposedly for are embracing it less. So it's not a recipe for success, I'd have to say.
I love that. I was over here taking notes, and I have to come back to one question that I think you may have an idea of. But before that, I wanted to transition it to Patrick to talk about, where do you think these appeals are coming from the Republican Party? You wrote the book, Party of the People, Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition, Remaking the GOP. So you should be the expert on this subject matter, which is really exciting to talk about. So, why are we seeing, to Ruy's point, more minority voters going to the GOP? And, is it just the economic stuff, or are there other elements that you think we're seeing that are contributing to that?
Yeah, so I think Ruy highlights an important structural factor, which is the role of ideology. So as we've seen racial depolarization, we've seen increased ideological polarization, which means that everyone who kind of identifies as conservative, regardless of your race, is now more likely to vote for the Republican candidate, just like everyone who identifies as liberal is most likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. That wasn't really the case because of non-white voters, because non-white voters had an historic attachment in the case of Black voters since the 1964 and the passage of the Civil Rights Act, have had an unbroken, really straight streak of loyalty to the Democratic Party that was often in the range of 90%. Even though there are many conservative, there's a lot of ideological diversity in the Black community, but politically there wasn't as much diversity. So we're starting to see that unwind a little bit. I think it's been gradual, but the polls suggest this cycle that it could be gradual, then all of a sudden, right? In terms of polls showing Trump upwards of 20%, maybe 25% of the African American vote, potentially outright winning the Hispanic vote, or coming pretty close within 10 points. And the question, I think, is why now? Right? Why it's taken 60 years. Democrats, we've had two elections with Donald Trump. We've had 60 years of historically Democratic voting in the African American community to the extent that we've seen it. Why are we seeing this break now? So I think what we've always seen is African American voters are just more pragmatic, pocketbook issue voters. So when it comes to the Democratic primary electorates, right, they're typically, when there is not a black candidate, when sort of racial identity, which is still very important in terms of ensuring representation, given the challenges I think the Black community has historically faced in getting, people from their community elected. So when that's taken away as a factor, they are a moderating force within the Democratic Party. And that was the thought in 2020, that they went and saved Joe Biden's bacon in the South Carolina primary, right? From Bernie Sanders and from the party moving way to the left. And in the same way, they elected Hillary Clinton. But as it turns out, obviously in 2016 and also in 2020, Democrats thought they had it made with these messages, really highlighting Trump's abnormality, right? Saying things like, this is not us. We are better than this. Appealing to making these high-minded appeals and talking about how Trump was a racist, he was a bigot, he was a xenophobe, he's sexist. And it turns out these appeals did not work to increase African American support for the Democratic Party. Certainly they were coming off of Barack Obama, so there may be a chance that they wouldn't. But you really had in 2020, when the baseline was 2016, and you had a white Democratic candidate with Hillary Clinton and another candidate from the same wing of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden, you saw that share of the vote also continue to decline. And this was after Trump's, seen questionable decisions around the George Floyd protests, right? Saying things like, we need to shoot looters in the street. So what's going on? For Black voters in particular, Donald Trump has been a catalyst. So I don't think I think it is absolutely the Democrats, have alienated, and people are become more ideologically aware of what the parties stand for. But I think Trump himself has been a catalyst. Trump is a populist. He is an anti-politician. These are voters who don't trust traditional politics, don't trust the system. And for many of these working class voters, you really are talking to people who have deep distrust of the political process, who think the corporations and the politicians are in bed together. And really, Trump was the only one in both in 2016 and 2020, and still today, who kind of embraces that way of thinking, that kind of stark language about being kind of an anti-establishment outsider figure. And when you look at kind of the Republican candidates before, who were more perhaps moderate, had a more of an appeal to, you had a Mitt Romney, who was a business guy, and people pine for him in the sort of traditional Republican Party. But when it came to appealing to working class constituencies, he was somebody who's certainly doing better at appealing to CEO types and well-educated types and the elite. Whereas Trump was somebody who, I think, unique for a Republican candidate, really spoke the language of the working class, which included many Black and Latino working class voters, when it comes to their basic worldview about politics, how the system works, how the country works.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Patrick. I don't think we should at all underestimate the role of Trump and himself as a catalyst, as you say, in making these things happen. I mean, look, he blew up, in a sense, the standard image of the Republican Party as sort of a bunch of country club twits who, basically just wanted to give business a free hand and really didn't care about people rotting in the, poor areas of major cities, right? I mean, he basically said, hey, you're right to think this whole system is rigged against you. You, a working class person, whatever color you are, this whole setup sucks. I'm going to blow it up. And I'm not here to get rid of Social Security, Medicare. I'm down on all these really bad trade deals that have hurt you. I'm your guy. And you're right not to trust these elites. They're not on your side. And I think that's continuing to play today in his so far relatively successful candidacy. And to your point about, the Democrats are still relying on these sort of high-minded, kind of things. Democracy's on the ballot. Trump is just a really bad person. Orange man bad. He's just not good. We are good people. We're better than that, right? And I think that's still, according to recent stuff that's come out in the press, that's still the guiding philosophy of the Biden campaign this year. Tom Donilon has famously said, when everybody pulls the lever in November, January 6th will be the biggest thing on their mind because, of course, that is, existential to our democracy. And I just huh? I'm not so sure that's right, particularly if we're talking about these non-white working class voters, among whom the Democrats have been losing ground. Is that really the way to get them back on your side, to just talk about the beauty of democracy and how Trump's an awful person? I've got my doubts about that.
Yeah, we're in the camp of democracy not being a winning issue because most people are like, what are you talking about anyway? Right? So it's not a phrase that normal people use in everyday conversation. But I loved what you mentioned about, highlighting Trump's abnormalities being not a winning strategy, because sometimes I look at, Democrats and I'm like, you're just as weird sometimes. Like, let's not point at the like you said, the orange guy and say that he's the only weird one here. It's like, you're very out of touch.
I don't think there's any understanding whatsoever among your typical, Democratic elite, Democratic activist, a lot of even consultants, that for a normie working class voter out there in this vast land of America, they look at the Democrats to a large extent too and say, who the hell are these people? They don't think like me. They don't talk like me. But I think because a lot of these people tend to live in a bubble, they can't, that does not compute. Trump is like way up here. He's so awful. And we're down here. We may have some flaws, but we're basically pretty great. And I just think if that was true, they wouldn't be having so many political problems, but it's not. So anyway, end of rant.
No, some of it's like pure social interaction. It's like, if you do get an opportunity to be in the same room as some people, you're like, I thought we were alike, but we're not nearly as interested. Alike as I thought we were. But say all that to say, wanted to shift it a little bit into the conversation about this, decline in racial polarization, because you guys have highlighted a few different types of polarization that I think we could talk about more here. And I'm curious to know y'all's thoughts on these specific ones, like age polarization. I've, obviously observed as a younger person that, there is a bit of discrepancy between younger Black people and older Black people, right? In my specific race. And then obviously gender polarization. There's a lot more women who are considering voting with Democrats because of the issue of abortion and whatnot. Ideological polarization, like you pointed out, and then obviously, like class polarization. So any thoughts on any of those types of polarizations, all of them from y'all on, why people are shifting in coalitions here?
Yeah, I think we're just seeing it's a kind of a mathematical truth in the sense of, as one type of polarization increases, another must decline. And something is just things that seem important in electoral politics in one cycle can be unimportant the next cycle. As pollsters in 2016, a lot of pollsters fell short because they didn't really think this education polarization, class polarization would be that big of a deal. And so didn't weight their surveys. You had exit polls saying, well, the electorate is 50% college educated, and it's growing
right.
more and more college educated every year.
Utterly fanciful. Yeah.
Right. Right. And it's and the real number is 36% college educated. And it's probably not going to grow that much bigger than that. So I think we saw a lot of the same with age polarization and racial polarization during the Obama era because of really who Barack Obama was. And I think so much of that, right, it really depends, it's contingent upon who the choices are that are put in front of us. And people respond viscerally to, the choices, right? And so you have Trump literally manifesting during the 2016 primaries. I love the poorly educated, right? And
That's great.
literally manifesting this, and not that that was the only thing, but it turns out that's who powered him to the nomination, and then that's who powered him to the presidency in those upper Midwest states, because he's speaking a language that's completely foreign to the political elite, that even Republican consultants like me who are horrified by this. And sort of, it's partly like, if you're a political consultant in Washington, D.C., and you don't see this with Tom Donilon by any stretch of the imagination, it's almost like you have to take your own personal biases and predilections and thoughts and theories about politics and kind of do the opposite. You're better off that way, because that's really where the working class majority of the country is, and that's what it is. But I think you're absolutely, the polarization we're seeing now is obviously partisan polarization, but I think who's in the parties is changing. You're seeing a more diverse Republican Party. And you're seeing education polarization, I think, continuing this sort of class polarization. But you're seeing massive racial and age depolarization, it seems like. Because I think, the contrast, I think, between a more populist, energetic Donald Trump, who's still old, but he's just projects a lot more energy and vitality and vigor than Joe Biden does. Really, that's, people are responding to the specific choices that are in front of them. And in 2028, there'll be a completely different set of choices, most likely, and they'll respond to those in turn.
And one thing I'm curious about, Patrick, is I agree that it seems to be significant age depolarization going on, but what's your assessment? I mean, I know there's been a lot of controversy about exactly how much of this is really going. Do we really believe polls that show Donald Trump so close to Biden among voters under 30 and so on? And, clearly it's a little hard to get a fix on this population. So what's your sense of what's going on, and also the extent to which it may be driven by some of the younger part of younger voters, in other words, Gen Z and so on, as opposed to, I mean, I find it a little hard to get a fix on. I mean, we can average the crosstabs across polls and get a sense there's clearly something going on, but there's also the counter argument. Well, at the end of the day, their underlying views will bring them back to the Democrats, and they're not engaged yet, blah, blah, blah. So I'm curious, what your assessment of the empirics is here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a less consistent evidence for age depolarization than there is for racial depolarization, although I absolutely think there will be some.
Mm-hmm.
I think it varies a lot based on whether you think these third-party candidates are going to be a factor or not. And I think if you actually see RFK and the motley of left-wing third-party candidates on the ballot, I think, especially among younger voters, I think you're going to see a good amount of defection. Now, is it going to be the same level of defection we're seeing in the polls right now? Maybe not, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, historically, third-party candidates tend to fade, but it seems like I don't know if the third-party voters are favoring decisively one candidate or the other if they had to choose. But they do seem to be hurting Biden more, just based on the demographic.
Yeah, I agree with that
for the Democratic Party. But I think that Biden is facing danger on multiple fronts. So you have polls that obviously some polls suggesting there's been a massive shift to Trump. I also don't think you can ignore the fact. I think it's partly the age depolarization, the function of racial depolarization. That you have a younger audience, a younger demographic. It's primarily, it's majority. It's not quite majority minority, but it's very different than older Americans.
Right.
So if you see these trends particularly among, let's say, younger minorities who aren't as anchored in the Democratic Party, that's where you're going to see the movement, and you're going to see the movement among low propensity voters. And by the way, you've got the Simon Rosenbergs of the world, you've got the Tom Bonyers of the world on there saying, well, it won't matter because these people won't vote. That's a very interesting position for a Democratic operative.
Low turnout, we love it.
Yeah, right. But the reality is, in 2020, we saw the same thing with Hispanics, that there was a late movement among low propensity Hispanics. Carlos Odio and Ekis had done some great research on this, that really the biggest shifts among Hispanic voters were among those who didn't traditionally vote. And so you have a reverse age
Mhm.
gap among
Right.
that's growing among Blacks and Hispanic voters, and particularly among younger Black men. It's true among Hispanics too.
Yeah, I think the younger Black and trends, as you say, particularly men, are very interesting because there is no part of the demographics based approach of the Democrats that is more of an article of faith than we're entitled to 90% of the Black vote, no matter what. But I mean, you look at the data for younger Black voters, and it's extraordinary how different it is than the older Black voters. There's just so much evidence of decaying attachment to the Democratic Party and a much bigger openness to voting for someone like Trump. And I think if this comes to fruition in this election, that, well, I don't say it will lead to some rethinking, but it certainly should lead to some rethinking of the baseline assumptions that Democrats tend to have about non-white populations in general and Black voters in particular. Because, back to our theme about, the decay of identity politics, decay of, I mean, this is one of the vectors, the younger they are, the less likely they are to be, absolutely, iron bound by bands of iron to the Democratic Party. That's not how they think about the world. They're not. But of course, one of the tremendous contradictions here is that a lot of the younger Black activists who represent these younger Black voters are completely different. I mean, these are activists, people in nonprofit groups, advocacy groups, voter mobilization. I mean, for whom there's no article of faith that they believe in more than, Republicans are the tool of Satan and we should never vote for them under any circumstance. They're all racist swine, So that's really a mismatch. These are the people like putting pressure on the Democrats and supposedly giving them advice about how to reach younger Black voters. And they're completely out of it, I mean, they're totally confusing their view of the world with the view of sort of the median young Black voter, particularly the median younger Black male voter. So different. So, it's just extraordinary.
Yeah, and the other thing I would mention, and I think the other structural factor, right? Because I think we could point all we want to the dynamics of the cycle and the candidates of the cycle. But I think the younger structural factors, we just live in a very different country than when that we did lived in when these voting patterns were first established. So even 20, 30 years ago, you had just much more segregation in
Mm-hmm.
terms of where people lived. You had really just a majority or a very solid percentage of African Americans living in majority Black neighborhoods. So there's this great book called Steadfast Democrats by Cheryl Laird and Ismail White, which I relied on heavily for the book.
Mm-hmm.
That really drills down on what are the foundations of this democratic allegiance and democratic loyalty, because you have this idea of linked faith, this idea that Black voters act collectively as a unit to support the Democratic Party to amplify their political power. But what they found, like kind of the thing that really, that really drove this is the more connected you are and the more embedded you are in the Black community, whether that's through the Black church, whether that's through living in all Black neighborhoods, whether that's through having all Black friends or majority of your friends are Black. You really have this, frankly, social. I mean, that's something they say. That's not what I'm saying. It's what they said. You really have this social expectation and pressure of you're automatically going to vote for the Democratic Party. Remember when Joe Biden goes on a podcast in
Oh,
2020,
right.
you're not for me. If you're
You
not for
ain't Black.
me, you ain't Black. Right. And that, I think,
Right.
reflected a certain mode of thinking, right? That wasn't like
Mm-hmm.
out of thin air. That reflected like how people, thought. But I do feel like, we are, you look at places like Las Vegas, Phoenix, you're seeing just people moving out of kind of big cities to Sunbelt states, red states. You see dramatically rising Black populations in the suburbs. And I just think we are living in an era, particularly younger Black voters, are growing up are coming up politically in a very different, more racially integrated environment, and so are voting more. I'm saying they're right wing voters, right? I'm
No,
saying that
no.
they are just going to be vote more like the average of people in those communities, and I think that people aren't fully ready for that. People are still kind of operating under this assumption that we still live in the America, maybe not of the 1960s, but maybe of the 1990s, and it's just a very different America now.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, Patrick. I mean, and again, it gets back to this idea that the people sort of strategizing about how Democrats can reach these voters and the people who are giving them advice. They're basically have a model of America and the model of minorities within America that's basically profoundly outdated because they are wedded to the notion very little has changed. This is still a terrible country. It's still white supremacist, structurally racist. I mean, use whatever term of art you prefer. And I think that leads you away from understanding the ways in which the country really has changed and how the voters, therefore, that live in these different places may be different than you're assuming. So, yeah, I think that's a very real factor. And I think, someday the Democrats will probably have to, adjust to that, though it doesn't look like it's happening exactly right now.
Well, I sure hope that someday is very soon because we don't have much time to figure this out.
No. Well, I mean, this cycle, I mean, I don't know what Patrick thinks, but I think things are baked in. I just don't think much is going to change between now and November. But I think afterwards, there's should be a lot of space for rethinking, including about issues like racial polarization. But right now, if everybody's in, we've got to crush the other side mode.
Yeah. And going back to something you all said earlier about minority men, I was telling some people in a caucus recently, and I was like, I think we need to consider all minority men independent voters. Like, let's stop just assuming they're going to vote with Democrats, because particularly, like you said, the men, women, not so much, I don't think, but the men, that's a different ballgame. So I completely agree with you on that. But going back to, this year, can we just pretend that we don't have a presidential election? Because I'm curious to know y'all's thoughts, right?
Okay.
Where are we seeing, appeals to minority voters on both sides working well? It doesn't necessarily have to be non-elected officials. It can be, lower ballot offices. Are you seeing governors appeal to minority voters from either side in a compelling way? I guess if you take the presidential election out of this the scenario this year for the purposes of this podcast, for that matter, where are you seeing wins on the left and the right?
Well, I think the biggest change, right, because I think Trump and the Republican side is leading in his appeals to minority voters. So I don't think you can divorce it entirely from the presidential election cycle, but just deliberately going into places like Detroit, Philly, South Bronx, holding rallies, and obviously, like you can probably, I mean, a lot of that is at rallies don't vote, but I think he's consciously signaling that he is actually going into these communities, and I think in particular, every time he goes into a UFC event, right? And that is followed by a lot of minority men, right? That he has really been prioritizing that type of visibility for his campaign, where I do think he is sending the message that, hey, I am not like the Republicans before. I am prioritizing your vote, and I am working to win your vote. Now, whether or not how does that translate on the ground? Does that translate to door knocking? Does that translate to advertising? We have yet to see. I do think in particular that, there is a chance, right, that, Trump could be the tip of the spear in the Republican Party for this type, but we still may see kind of this question of this sort of so-called down ballot lag that, they still may vote Democrat for a lot of these down ballot offices. It seems like there's been more evidence of that, of Democrats being able to hold on to some of these diverse constituencies in Senate races, and there being a pretty big divide in some of these Senate races between Trump at the top of the ticket and still voting for Democrats as far as it comes to control of the U.S. Senate. It'll be very interested to see, not that this is going to be probably the most competitive race, but it'll be very interested to see what happens in Maryland with Larry Hogan. I think he has traditionally been somebody who has appealed strongly in the Black community and has gotten elected in a very highly Democratic state with a 30% African-American population.
Yeah, I think actually what you're mentioning about the difference between how the Biden-Trump race at the top of the ticket and the Senate races in a lot of these swing states is an interesting, perhaps, insight into how Democrats can do best among minority constituencies. It's not treating them as, like really different from everybody else, sort of appealing them based on identity politics, but rather running on pretty normie kitchen table, I'm going to make your life better and here's how. And the Republicans are going to take that good life away from you and here's how, right? I mean, pretty standard, appeal that, basically implicitly, particularly in terms of working class voters, making the appeal that we're on your side, the other folks are not. And here's the evidence. Here's what we're for. Here's what the other side is for. Kind of a more of an old school type approach, and really getting away from how the Democrats have tended to present themselves in the last period of time. So I think, I wouldn't say that's actually the solution in and of itself, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And we'll see how that works itself out over time. But I think the Democrats, and I imagine you agree with this, Lauren, have a lot of work to do in trying to figure out, a better formula for appealing to normie, working class, non-white voters, which is really where the action is in the end.
Oh, of course. I mean, that's the bread and butter of what we do and why we do it. And even this podcast in particular is called The Depolarizers, right? So we're trying to think about how we can, go back to issues that matter most to people, meet them where they are, not just geographically, but ideologically, et cetera. Because to your point, Patrick, about Trump going to places in inner cities and stuff like that, it's like, okay, you're going to see them, but are you bringing them the matters that they can identify with and agree with, right? And I'm wondering, again, back to the theme of depolarization, are you seeing moderates on either side finding ways to break through the extremism to appeal to minority voters? Something that I think about often is that, politics is a game that a lot of people feel excluded from. Because it can be complex. It can be obviously hard to access because of money and whatnot. So, are you seeing people, particularly minority voters, finding appeals from moderates on either side that are compelling to them because they're coming to them again more ideologically versus just identity? If that makes sense.
Look, I think across the spectrum, we generally see that, right? I mean, I think you look at Democrats in Pennsylvania, right, have had success with candidates who have been perceived. Somebody like John Fetterman is very heterodox, let's say, ideologically. You have Josh Shapiro, obviously.
Yeah.
And so I do think those candidates still kind of see success, but I do kind of wonder about the knock-on effects, because I think that in many ways, look, Democrats still have an advantage here because you have this constituency of pretty moderate African American voters, to some extent Latino voters, but I think the African American political power has been institutionalized to a large degree in the Democratic Party, who anchor, right? I think keep the Democratic Party more grounded in need to appeal to the center of the electorate, and oftentimes prevent candidates from getting nominated who would be sort of ideologically off the deep end. Now, maybe New York 16, the primary that recently happened, that was a win for moderation. Now, I think like whatever the diverse parts of the districts probably voted along racial lines, so that's a little bit of an outlier, particularly with these squad elections. Are a little bit of an outlier. But when you look at sort of, when race is not a factor in Democratic primaries, generally speaking, you have some guardrails, right, from just a strident ideologue leaning Democratic primaries in a way that you probably don't have as much of on the Republican side, frankly. Trump being an example, not that I would say he's a strident ideologue, but in terms of, somebody who appeals directly to the base of the ideological base of the party. Democrats have had more guardrails. And what happens if that goes away?
Yeah, no, those guardrails are key because in a sense, they're keeping, moderate voters from voting their moderation, in the Democratic Party and among some of these racial constituencies. I mean, the conservatives, obviously, the spell has been broken. These kind of voters feel more free to vote their ideology. But the moderates within the party, which is really the majority, including among, non-whites, there's still a lot of things kind of fencing them in, as it were, and keeping them sort of voting for candidates who are really probably more progressive than they are. So how do they make their voices heard? Well, part of it is just going to be if the guardrails, as you say, Patrick, start coming down, that sort of institutional structure, those networks that keep them down on the farm, so to speak, they start breaking down, and then these moderate voters will have more degrees of freedom to vote what they really think and what they really feel.
Yeah, which is, Ruy, you just articulated much better than I could have what I was kind of trying to get at, because, yeah, I think that that's a major problem, right? Because to your point about, the progressive staffers usually being, Black or Hispanic people. And it's like, yeah, they might be, the face of a lot of people who are in this Democratic coalition, but they're not representing the ideology or the sentiments of these voters, right? And so that's very deceiving, right? And I think that your point about keeping people fenced in is so kind of tragic in some ways, because there are so many opportunities for, like you said, a more moderate or centrist or populist even approach to certain things, and yet people feel like they have to go with this camp versus allowing for there to be more nuance within the party, which is scary. So we are getting up on time here, but this was a great conversation, guys. Like I want to take y'all to lunch and keep going on this one day, because this is so good.
Well, sure, come on down to DC and
take
us out.
I need to. That's really need to, because this was so fantastic. So our final question on our podcast is always, what is a depolarizing activity that listeners can partake in? Right. So it could be reading one of y'all's books. It could be reading a friend's book or someone like another book that you've enjoyed. It can be, civically engaging in some way, doing, some type of voter or volunteer activity, whatever. It could be anything. It could just be, staying off Twitter for that matter. Right. So what are some depolarizing activities that you think listeners can participate in to, as we strive to achieve more balance within our politics? How can people be part of that?
Okay, I'll go first. Actually, I have it's to some extent, a path I've trod, but I do think it's worthwhile. I mean, I think part of what keeps people in these different camps is essentially absorbing only information and views from one side, and sort of categorizing anything that's coded the other side as being completely, wrong. It just must be misinformation. There's nothing to see there, nothing to pay attention to. In fact, a good, for example, Democrat would never read anything from a conservative source. But I think that is just a really bad idea. I think if you want to get the nuances of what's going on in our country and in our politics and open up your mind and become, a vector of depolarization, you really want to read what the other side has to say. Not everything. You don't have to go read what Turning Point USA has to say if you're a Democrat, but you should read, stuff from the American Enterprise Institute, stuff from the Manhattan Institute, stuff from National Review, which is actually, most Democrats would think, I should never read anything from National Review. Those people are terrible. But there's actually a lot of good journalism. You may not agree with it all, but, they do their homework, they write well. And there are countless examples of this. And of course, then there's the whole heterodox space. It's not even explicitly conservative or liberal, but which has been growing like topsy, particularly on Substack. Read some of those people. Open up your damn mind and listen to some points of view that aren't, sort of part of your tribal, heritage or whatever. I mean, that's I think a key way for people to help depolarize things. Just become a depolarizer yourself.
Well, I was going to say listen to focus groups, although I think there's very few people who normally do that. But I do. Right. One of the things I would encourage folks, we have tried to give people a peek behind the curtain in terms of some of the swing voter type of focus groups that we conduct here at my firm and in partnership oftentimes with Democratic firms. So I feel like in my personal life, I try to live up to this because oftentimes we do work and, with Democratic leaning organizations to try to bring out the truth of what voters think about issues. But there's a great series. My partner, Kristen Soltis-Anderson, is part of conducting with the New York Times that they do voter focus groups of various key audiences. And you really see, it's not really about exposing yourself to, let's say, if you're a hyper political on the left, and you want to expose yourself to people who are hyper political on the right, so much as exposing yourself to people who are non-political and how they think about politics, which is oftentimes very eye-opening when you really are sitting in a room with people who are just undecided about who they're going to vote for, and to see their thought process. And the issue set is just completely different than you would get, even if you're paying attention to partisans on the other side, and trying to take the average of the two. It's just a very different mentality, I think. There's a lot of skepticism and maybe even cynicism about politics and about the system. And it really opens your eyes to, how somebody like Donald Trump could be appealing, or could be more appealing to African American voters than previous iterations of Republicans, and things like that. I'd say the New York Times America in Focus series would be one thing I would definitely read through those focus group transcripts and those videos.
Yeah, listen to the normies. I think that's great advice.
That's always great advice. Focus groups and open up your damn minds. I absolutely love it, guys. Thank you so much. This was such a good conversation, Ruy and Patrick. I genuinely appreciate you both and have been enjoying all of it and excited to get it out for people to listen to. So thanks for joining, and have an awesome rest of your afternoon.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think it was great. See you all around.
All right. Thanks. Y'all take care.